Or would you mind giving me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Thank you, sir.
that will be doing presentations, Kathy Johnson and Dr. Zach Conrad. Kathy this evening will be reviewing the current budget status. Kathy has reviewed this in numerous settings. Most of you are aware of it. She will make a brief presentation there. Dr. Conrad will then look at scenarios focused on possible boundary adjustments. He's done a great deal of work there. He will go through those scenarios and provide them to you for input and feedback. Would like to remind everyone this evening, no decisions have been made. We are starting the process that will work back and forth between the Budget Program Evaluation Committee and the Boundary Advisory Committee. After tonight's meeting, we hope to have enough information to begin moving forward on costing out some of the scenarios as you direct us to do. Would like to begin now by introducing Kathy Johnson.
Good evening, or afternoon, I guess. I'll just be brief. A lot of this information I shared fairly extensively with you all on the 18th of November about our district budget trends. And so just a reminder that the budget conversations we're having and the need for reductions is a direct result of student enrollment and enrollment weighting droppings. You know, our enrollment decline, 597.5 FTE. We actually have 255 decrease in our virtual education on top of that, and then our enrollment weightings of about 181. So everything's going down. And it doesn't appear that those numbers are turning, or that the tide is turning, and that we're going to see increases as the projections going forward are showing. And so the state will come and do our enrollment audit. That doesn't happen until March. It's rare numbers go up at audit. It's not uncommon that they're either similar, or we might even realize an additional decline. So all of those things are what are generating these budget discussions and boundary discussions that are occurring. When you look at that enrollment decrease for 22-23, which is what we're planning for, compared to the planned funding we had for 21-22, it's about a $3.2 to $3.7 million decrease in our funding that it will realize when we have to actually realize those enrollment declines, which is significant. In addition, if the board wants to consider additional compensation or needs to deal with cost of living increases and things like insurance, transportation, utilities, we know we have a natural gas rate increase, things like that that were discussed at the board study session on December 20th, that's on top of that decline. And I know at the 20th, I think kind of the top number thrown out is, you know, considerations, it could be up to $7 million if you were to try to add all those in, depending upon what that would look like. And just as a reminder, it was shared at the November 18th, and we've shared it in a couple of other spaces, that if you look at all of our salary pool dollars, 1% is about $825,000. So thinking about 2%, 3%, you can kind of do the math on your own on that one. So we've had 9 subcommittees of the Budget and Program Evaluation Committee work through 3 proposals each of low, medium, and high for consideration. Boundary changes, school closures, those were mentioned in 3 different subcommittees: the elementary subcommittee, the middle school subcommittee, and the ESOL subcommittee. And then there's other proposals. Some are generating savings without school closure or boundary changes. Some involve school closure or boundary changes, and some require a blend of that. And so kind of doing those in tandem and then seeing what makes sense in the holistic picture of things is where we end up. In the end, the Board of Education will be who makes that final decision as to what we end up doing going forward. As Larry mentioned, no specific school has been said this is what's happening, no boundary. There's just discussions. There's just exploration of what those scenarios could look like, might look like, and the result if you were to do. So lots of if this, then this type stuff is really the discussion. It'll be the boundary committee and the budget committee that kind of helps vet those various scenarios out and looks at budget savings tied to those. And so when Zach shares those with you tonight, those will be things that will be following up as that. Some of the things that the subcommittees noted as considerations, pros and cons, as we think about boundaries and school closures. Are there elementary schools that require, or middle schools that require significant capital outlay needs, where it really would take a pretty significant investment to bring it where it needs to be? Does that make sense for something that we would consider? Looking at the utilization of our existing facilities, that 85 to 90% utilization is kind of that prime, and do we have schools under that? Are there transportation costs, growth in the district, growth across the city? How does that look long range for future planning? Those things should be considered. Operational cost savings, because that's really what we're trying to generate is some savings. Do some of these movements create full-time staff in buildings where currently those smaller schools have less than 1.0? What does that look like, and does that make a difference in our decision-making? We want to look at impacts to student displacement, distance to neighborhood schools, demographics, and all those programmatic changes that fall into play, ESL, cluster sites, special education, et cetera. So it's a big thing to undertake, and I know Zach has done a whole lot of work on this, and he's going to share next, so I don't want to take any more time that will detract from his time. So I'm going to turn it over, or turn it back to Larry, whichever one wants to do it, and move on. So thank you.
Zach, if I can interrupt you just for a minute. Kathy talks about people doing an awful lot of work on this. A real thank you to Kathy Johnson. Kathy has done an incredible amount of work to get us to this point. Thank you very much. Zach will now begin walking us through some scenarios. I want to reiterate again, these are only scenarios, starting points. No decisions have been made, no recommendations have been made, and Zach has done a great deal of work on putting together these scenarios, and as of this afternoon said he's ready to continue putting together scenarios. Zach, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Engelbrick and Kathy. So before we get started, portions of this is going to be interactive. We have a live stream going. There were community members who wanted to view this, and so we have a live stream going right now that you can watch on YouTube. Because of that, we want to make sure that everybody can be heard. And so there are 2 microphones out here. Before you speak, we need to get a microphone in front of your mouth so that everybody can hear you, our participants online and the participants on the live stream. So just keep that in mind, that we're going to bring a microphone to you during this portion if you have a comment, some feedback, some conversation. For those of you online, for the committee members online, we'll be able to raise your hand and or just speak up, and we'll all be able to hear you. So with that, I think Kathy did a fantastic job of introducing why we are here, particularly here at the Boundary Committee meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides, and we're going to walk through slideshow. Let's start that. So we should be able to see, let me pull it up here. There we go. And let's, oh, we have some people waiting in the lobby I need to admit. There we go. Close that out. Make that full screen. Okay. All right. So this came from the Budget Committee. And the Budget Committee subgroups, like Kathy mentioned, tasked us with a couple of objectives here. To explore some boundary shifts with the purpose of cost savings, and to also send them back what we agree on for them to run numbers on where it comes to savings, because that's the ultimate goal. And so we're going to review those. We'll also have some time for feedback, and then we'll also be able to send our recommendation back to them on some of the changes that we're wanting to see. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at projections of where we're headed over the next few years. Typically, we have relied on RSP in the past to give us some of these projections. I'm going to walk through how I have put together some projections for our numbers, because one of the things that we do have concerns about is that growth. How do we support growth if we're maximizing some of our other spaces? And so I want to be able to look at putting together these projections. Here's just some of the steps that I took, and some of the things that I observed. So first I looked at historical data. I then looked at, I noticed that elementary stays relatively stable. Growth is typically seen in 7th grade and 9th grade. And on average, we have about 57 student gain from 1st grade to 12th grade. And most of that comes in 9th grade. Now, I also estimated kindergarten, what's going to be coming in over the next few years. We're noticing that births are decreasing in the county. That was unpleasant. I apologize. We also look at our conversion rate. And for our conversation, I actually put the conversion rate at 64% because we've seen some really low years, especially last year. That's kind of dragging that percentage down. So I use 64%. And then I went ahead and projected some ranges, some highs and lows. So I looked at if we just maintain every student comes the next year, which we all know that does not actually take place, but just same numbers, and with our incoming kindergarten class, what they're projected to be, and then what our final number would be at the end. So I actually would like to show, these are the actual numbers that we had on our SO66 report, starting in kindergarten, starting with the year 2000, 2001. Here's where we ended in 12th grade. And here is our K-12 total. Now this column includes the PK-12 total, but we're going to focus on this K-12 total when it comes to projections, because that PK number is a lot harder to estimate. And so I went ahead and built some cohorts. We have 10 cohorts over that time period. And what I did is I watched them. You started with us in kindergarten. The next year you're in 1st grade, then 2nd grade, then 3rd grade, then 4th grade, then 5th. All the way to 12th grade. We have 10 cohorts that we can follow all the way through. And I ran the numbers just to see averages from 1st grade to 12th grade. We increased by about 57 students, like I said before. And then I looked at by grade level in these cohorts to see where we're seeing this growth. So traditionally, when we had half-day kindergarten, we saw a bigger bump from kindergarten to 1st grade. We just saw an increase of students entering our 1st grade class. We no longer see that same bump, so I ran a couple different options there to average that out, a 5-year average and a 10-year average. Again, we see over time historically, we stay relatively flat in elementary. What you get in kindergarten, let me blow that up a bit, I apologize. What you get in kindergarten, 1st grade, it stays relatively stable over the last 10 cohorts. We see that a bump happens in 7th grade and a bump happens in 9th grade. I think we can attribute this to some of our private schools in town and some of our extracurricular activities that encourage kids to join maybe our middle school or our high school. But like I said before, that cohort data is based on some early numbers. We know that we have shifted a bit. And so I went ahead and ran some averages from grade to grade. So this is 2001 to 2002 students, all the way down to 21, 22 students. Okay? I did the average, so this is grade to grade. So the cohorts are much smaller. It's not from first grade to 12th grade. It's just year over year. And I ran the averages. You can see here that kindergarten to first grade is high. It's much higher than the last 10 years. And the last 5 years has seen negative. We did have a COVID year in there that did greatly impact this. And so that's why I'm running off the 10-year average to kind of even all of that out. But again, we're not seeing tremendous growth, almost no growth over the last 20 years. Kindergarten class, or what you come in with at your kindergarten class stays fairly stable. This may not be true for building specific, but district-wide, it is very stable over the last 20 years. We haven't seen tremendous growth in elementary. The same holds true for middle school, where we still have that 7th grade year in there, where we see a slight bump, on average 13 student gain. And then again in high school, we see the 9th grade bump, about 52 students there. So I do want to focus our attentions right here. We started in 2001 school year with 10,284 students. This town has seen growth since then. But as we come down, we could see that we are not realizing that growth when it comes to a student population. So yes, we may grow as a town, as a community, but unfortunately we're not seeing that translate over here over the last 20 years of looking at this data. We had some lean years in there and we've gone up and down. But overall, we really haven't seen growth within our school district over the last 20-some years, even though the community has seen growth. So one of the things that we did want to look at is the county births and our conversion rate there. So here in 2005, we had 1,235 births in the county. Now, that translates into our kindergarten class of 2010, 2011. 693 of those students, or those births, those kiddos, became students at a 56% conversion rate. We could see that throughout the years. And 2017 or 2016, we're starting to see this decline. And we are also starting to see, on average, we converted 60% of our students that year. And then the prior year, a COVID year, we only converted about 50%. And so conversion rate matters, but births matter. Here we know that the birth rate is decreasing, or the live births are decreasing, and we anticipate that they'll continue to decrease. There's nothing that's indicating that that is going to increase either locally, nationally, internationally. Population is decreasing. We're having fewer kids as a population. That trend is not unique to Douglas County, but overall we're having fewer kids. And so that's going to translate into some projections. So if I take our average of 64% and look at 2019, I know that we decreased. We had 1,088 live births. Even if I take the average, we're teetering on 700 still. And if we continue to decrease, our entering kindergarten class will continue to decrease. And we know once we get those kindergartners in there, it stays relatively stable. So then we base our projections on this. And this is what I spoke about earlier, my projections. So these are the actual numbers that we saw earlier. if I took our entering kindergarten class of 709, let me blow this up a bit more. So we had an entering kindergarten class of 709 students. If I just move them to first grade next year, which we know doesn't happen, but if I just move them over and assume we're keeping everybody, next year we project to be at 9,843, which is lower than this year because our incoming class is a bit lower. If I was to take a low estimate and use the change over time, my 10 years, on average, we lose 15 kids. On average, we lose 4 kids. We lose 13 kids. We lose 3 kids. So if I was to take that average of what we typically see, and again, an average has a range, so you can increase. There's years that increase. This is just the average. I have this light blue line of where those numbers would be, and a low projection would be around 9,400 students. Again, still decreasing because we're entering with lower numbers. And then we average out the attrition that we typically see. So my projection would be we're somewhere between there. And we have our county birth rate up to the 2024-2025 school year. And so I ran both of those projections, and we tend to trend down because the birth rate trended down. Or not birth rate, the live births in the county trended down. There are a lot of other factors that play into enrollment in our schools. But as we saw before, over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of factors that we've accounted for, and it hasn't necessarily translated into higher enrollment. So these are just projections, and things can change. The sun can shine even when the meteorologist predicts rain, right? I mean, it can happen. But there's no indication, we're not seeing indicators that that's going to take place. The county is projecting by 2030 that we'll see a 1.5 increase in growth. Now that's a lot of years to only see 1.5% increase in growth, and we also know that that doesn't necessarily translate into kiddos in our schools, as we've seen over the last 20 years. So I say all of that because I'm not entirely optimistic that our growth is going to bounce back in the next couple years, just looking at those live births. And that's a foundation for us to also make some decisions when it comes to our boundaries and the capacity at our schools. So with that, are there any questions over how I compiled some of this data or the process? And remember, if you're in the room, we need a microphone in front of your mouth before you speak. So there's one right here.
Yeah, Zach, I was just curious, so this data, does that come from your extractions or that RSP? What was the enrollment group that was hired to sort of give all those projections? Is that in conjunction with this, or?
So, yeah, the question was about if maybe I worked with RSP or if I use some of their data or how we combined some of this data. And these are actually not RSP. We submit this data to the state, where you see there. And then the county births, that information just came from, actually it was KU, who has a research center that does a report, I believe, for the state. And so that's where these numbers came from. And then all of this stuff is just our data looking at averages. I think we have compiled enough data to have some reliable averages in there. And so that's where those are coming from. Any other questions pertaining to this? If not, we can move along to some of the scenarios that we base this on. I'm not seeing any hands raised online either. Oh, GR did. Oh, we got two. Sorry. Yes. Either one, go ahead. GR, are you going to talk? Oh, he is talking. Try again.
Okay, how about now?
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Perfect. Yay. So it's kind of related to the first question, based on RSP. So just a little bit of background. Having served on the boundary committee before I got elected, and then being on boundary as a board member, and now being back on boundary as a non-board member, having looked at RSP data for I don't know, 7 years now, it is and this is not an accusatory question. It is a procedural question from the district. Is you running these numbers outside of RSP? Is this a indication of a move from the district to move away from RSP projections because we're not going there for this process, or is it a matter of speed or timing to get RSP to give us data, or what kind of is the impetus to not utilize them in this case?
So we have not renewed the contract with RSP.
Okay.
Obviously, it comes at a cost.
Yep.
In a time where we're attempting to spend less. And so looking at them historically, they've had some years that have been more accurate than other years. Of course,
Yep.
they're all projections. And so where they have projected us at to be right now, again, is in the, it's around 10.5. And so there's a little distance there. But we haven't re-engaged with them this year.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Zach, this is Alnita. I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This might be a little premature on this, but question, are any of the numbers relative to specific schools on growth in the numbers going down?
So I looked at the district holistically. There are some schools in decline and some schools that are seeing growth. But for this purpose, we looked holistically at the district as a whole, primarily because we're focusing as a whole how to shift kiddos around. But we can break down by building as well to show growth and lack thereof. Why'd that change? Any other questions? Okay. For those of you participating online, I have emailed you the scenarios. And for those of you in person, I do have additional copies. So if you do not have a copy of the scenarios, we can get you a copy of the scenarios. So, where'd my, there it is. Okay, so those are some of the projections. And then, like Kathy mentioned, I'll just reiterate, the budget subcommittees wanted our task to be threefold, to look at three scenarios: an elementary scenario, a middle school scenario, and an ESOL scenario. And it has multiple criteria, which Kathy also mentioned. And so buildings that require significant investment or has had the least amount of recent investment, we had to look at size. It is more difficult to redistribute students from a larger building to smaller buildings than it is from smaller buildings to larger buildings. And so that's a consideration. And then future capacity. And then we also explored middle school. Middle school was limited to just one option. So for the Boundaries Committee, we just have one scenario there. And again, it's just due to size on how that functions. Now, ESOL, the Budget Committee wanted to explore redistributing Hillcrest specifically. So I am still working through those details. That's a little bit more tricky as we look to distribute one school to a lot of schools while also redistributing kids from another building. So two buildings, but one of them happens to be Hillcrest. And so that one's still a little bit more tricky, and there's finances involved with that one, where if they go back to home buildings, are they going to have a certified or an endorsed teacher there? Otherwise, we lose funding. Or if we're building cluster sites out of it, how do we then move students out to then support an increase in ESOL students arriving in their building? So that one's just a little bit more tricky. I'm still working through. So we're actually going to explore the middle school option, and that's what the Budget Committee has asked us to do. And then we'll also explore the combination of elementary. So the first scenario, all the scenarios that we're going to look at involve these schools. And so these schools were chosen in these scenarios based on some of these reasons here. And so Broken Arrow, I think that we've known for some time that it needs some improvement there, especially to increase the, equality of instruction and the delivery of that. They are broken up in a way, or they're actually not broken up, they're combined in a way that is less conducive for learning in some of those environments. And so they're at somewhat of a disadvantage compared to other buildings. They also have had the least amount of improvements through the last bond issue. And that was one of the things that we wanted to look at. The other three elementary schools are Woodlawn, New York, and Pinckney. This is because of size. And so these schools with enrollment are typically under 200 students, especially if you take out transfers, and also looking at what boundaries they butt up against and how students can shift around. The middle school that was selected was Liberty Memorial Central. And again, it's based on size and capacity. It's the only possible option. The other three middle schools cannot be redistributed in the same way because Liberty Memorial lacks capacity to take them on. And there's more of those students that would need to be redistributed. So based on my work in exploring those options, Liberty Memorial was the only one that is plausible within these scenarios. So I want to draw everybody's attention to the first scenario, scenario 1, and that's in your packet. For those of you online, it's labeled the same, scenario 1. And we're going to walk through, I'm going to be showing everybody here. I don't know if I'm on camera and you can actually see it there, but it's not on the screen. I can actually bring it up though. Let me do that. Let me see. Item writing. So this is scenario 1. And what we're looking at is Broken Arrow, New York, Pinckney, Woodlawn, and Liberty Memorial Elementary School. So in this scenario, we would be shifting students around from all of these buildings in order to create capacity at the 85%. Remember, our objective here is from the Budget Committee, who is wanting us to explore scenarios where there is significant budget savings. This scenario has the most movement between schools, but just rough estimates, and I'm looking at Kathy because this is going to be a rough estimate, and you cannot hold me to it. But we're probably only halfway there, not even halfway there, of what the board had mentioned Monday night of being our goal for budget savings. So even in this scenario, where there are multiple buildings that we're shifting students around, it's not even getting us halfway there to that goal. So there's a lot of additional things that need to happen. And from this scenario on, you're realizing even less savings. Okay, so this might be a halfway point, to get us to that goal. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about this. We might look at this and say, this is a big movement, but at the same time, it's not even getting us halfway to our goal, even though it's big movement. So as we talk about lesser movements, just keep that in mind as we discuss this. And so on this first table that you see, you could see that Broken Arrow is that top column, and Broken Arrow has 0 students in it. That's not entirely accurate. If you go down to Billy Mills capacity is at 958. Well, the total number of students there is at 958. Because we are suggesting that Broken Arrow get repurposed to expand into Billy Mills to be able to hold Liberty Memorial students. Okay? So Broken Arrow opens up for Billy Mills to incorporate additional students, middle school students. As we continue to go down, you see Cordley Elementary, Deerfield, Hillcrest, Langston Hughes, those numbers increase. New York and Pinckney and Woodlawn also have 0s, but you'll notice that Liberty Memorial Central does not. But you'll notice where those students are now, instead of middle school under grade level, they're actually elementary school. So Liberty Memorial gets repurposed as an elementary school, housing 3 of our elementary schools, acting as a 4-section school, similar to what is on the west side of town with larger schools of 4-section schools. Now, there are a few options that we're still exploring on whether or not that's a temporary place and something gets constructed, or if that is now an elementary school. And so those are some of the thoughts that go into this. On the very next page, on the back side, and I'm going to scroll down here, this next table, you have your student count, you have the capacity of the building, you have what 85% capacity would look like, and then you have the difference between the two. So you'll notice that Cordley Elementary is almost exactly at 85% capacity when we shift students around. Deerfield is above 85% capacity by about 25 students, but they are under overall capacity. Hillcrest is under capacity by about 23 students of that 85% capacity, and so on down the list. So the total student count is the 6,000 at the bottom. We have capacity for about 9,200. 85% capacity is 7,800. And we have a difference still of about 72 students. I have also put charts in there what ESOL will look like so that we can start planning for resource allocation there. On the following table, and I'll keep scrolling, that's ESOL. Following table, we have SPED, so that our departments can start making arrangements there. And then free and reduced lunch so that we could start calculating for title. In this scenario, I'll walk through it a bit verbally. I may actually be able to pull it up. Let's pull it up. It may need to load. I have some descriptors here of how we've moved students around. And is it on this one? Oh, it's this page. So we have New York would move. There'd be a section of students that I've kind of titled here, the 15th in Haskell, 19th in Harper. That's not exactly very descriptive of what's going to happen there. But those were my notes, and when I pull up this map, if I pull up this map, I don't know where that is. And then all of Broken Arrow students move into Schwegler. So we, 30 New York students to Cordley. All of Broken Arrow moves into Schwegler. 41 Prairie Park students move to Hillcrest. We have 25 non-ESOL from Hillcrest that move to Sunset Hill. That's west of Iowa. That actually, I think that some of these boundaries actually make more sense. And if I could get my map to pull up, we'll see that. I honestly don't know where it is. Or why it's not showing. Let's force quit it and open it. 99 students from Sunflower will move to Quail Run. So that's north of Clinton Parkway. There's a section of students that would move into Quail Run. And then there's students from Quail Run that move into Deerfield. And then we would have 147 students that are Schwegler students right now that would move into Sunflower. And then Liberty Memorial becomes an elementary school, absorbing the remainder of those students out of Pinckney, Woodlawn, and New York. Hopefully I can open this up and we can start looking at some of those movements. Okay. Okay. So now we can visualize some of this. So we have some Quail Run students here by Free State that would move to Langston Hughes. You also have some students in here that would move over to Deerfield, freeing up space in Quail Run. Okay? Those are, I think, these students used to be Langston Hughes students and make some sense there. And then these students over here would then go to Deerfield, freeing up space in Quail Run. We would then move these Sunflower students that are north of Clinton Parkway right here, that would go into Quail Run. Sunflower would then absorb these students here in this section, freeing up space for all of Broken Arrow students to go to Schwegler. And you can see Schwegler's capacity would increase there. They'd be almost at exactly 85%. Right? And then with New York, let me zoom out a bit. There'd be a section of students here that would then go to Cordley. That's the section. Here's 15th Street up to Haskell and then 19th Street. So there's a handful of kiddos in there that would go over to Cordley. And then Woodlawn, New York, and Pinckney would be able to fit into Liberty Memorial as an elementary school. So that is scenario one, where we have movement amongst 5 buildings. Well, we have movement amongst all the buildings, and a repurpose of 2 of them. Into something that they aren't currently. So Broken Arrow and Liberty Memorial. Broken Arrow would expand as Billy Mills, and Liberty would become an elementary school. So at that point, Liberty would have been the district office, a high school, junior high, a middle school, and an elementary school. So what questions do we have over scenario 1? Or thoughts or comments? Microphone is right behind you.
How do transportation costs factor into the cost savings, especially bringing kids so far all the way to like Liberty Memorial?
So right now, we're looking at boundary scenarios. I've passed all of this information off so that we could start looking at the financial piece of this for the budget committee. But here we haven't done a whole lot quite yet. Well, I can't speak for Kathy. Kathy's probably done a ton. But right now in the boundaries committee, we're focused on that. But we are factoring all of that in.
Hey, Zach, this is Kay online. One of the questions I have, what is kind of the estimated classroom sizes for these different areas with this movement?
So again, the cost savings is still being calculated. I gave just a rough idea that this scenario probably gets us halfway, probably less than halfway to the stated board goal. And so estimating.
Sorry, Zach, I said classroom size?
Oh, classroom size. So we do have the section counts. This is what the new sections would be. And we have to work back through, sorry, I pointed to my paper. How silly of me. So that first table shows us the number of students at each grade level. And then we're going to have to work with HR to then calculate sections and what that will look like. We're going to see some class sizes go down because they're going to be able to break into that 4th section. And so right now, some schools are at that threshold of having 3 sections, and they're maxing out those 3, but they're not quite at the point of getting to 4 sections. And this will push some of those to 4 sections where they get additional staff, and we'll see a decrease in some buildings. We will see some increase in other buildings. Sorry for misunderstanding you at first. Apologize. Amy, you have a question?
Yes, Zach, I was curious when you say that this first scenario doesn't get us halfway quite to the board goal. Are we talking the board goal of 3.2 to 3.7 million, or the more expensive one where they're adding in possible raises?
So at the last board meeting, the goal that was mentioned was 7 million and change. Erica is here. I don't know if you want to speak to any of that. Okay. So that was what was mentioned at the last board meeting as the goal. So that's what I'm referring to. So it would get us somewhere around, and again, rough estimates, and I'm sorry, Kathy, I should keep my mouth shut, but 3 to 3.5, just based on some of the estimates of if you shift building, you're saving about 7,000, or I'm sorry, 700,000, 700 to 800,000. Those were some of the estimates that the budget subcommittees were given, and so those are the numbers that I'm working off of. Yes, a question in here. Oh, I'm sorry, Erica. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, yes, I have a question. It kind of goes back to what Kay was saying. And no, there hasn't been official board action on budget number, so just to comment on that
Right.
briefly. So for some of the students from the smaller schools that are used to smaller class sizes, moving them into another school that's larger, even though if we added more sections, the class sizes could be smaller than what that current school is used to, but bigger than what the other students that come from smaller schools are used to. So when it comes to budget, have those resources to help those students navigate a larger class sizes, is that figure figured into the other school?
So that is actually a proposal to look at staffing scenarios, and that's something that's being worked on outside of this committee. But that was one of the proposals that was brought as looking at the sections and class sizes and right sizing. And so, yes, conversations are taking place, not necessarily in this committee about that, but yeah. Did I answer your question?
Okay, page 2 of scenario 1, Zach, you have the capacities listed for each school, correct?
Correct.
And it's 9,200. Is that current or with the proposal, or, because I see it still has a number for Broken Arrow, right? But the capacity is going to stay at 9,200 even with the,
Yeah, you're right. I should have deleted that out. That number needs to go down.
okay.
You're right.
Because my question would be, whatever the capacity number ends up being, right? What is the plan for the fluctuation in numbers if we get back up towards the 10,000 mark?
So we still, if you subtract out that 350, from where we currently are to 85%, so student count is 6643, and 85% you'd have to minus out that 29 or 297.5 out of that number. And so we still have capacity in there to expand. We've never expanded 1,000 students in one school year. We've never expanded really over 300 students in a school year. And so we still have some capacity in there for growth. And this is the 85%. That's, I mean, we can reasonably go up to that 95% before we need to start exploring additional options, which I would foresee we have some years to move in that direction to make sure we're okay.
Zach, this is Kay. I had two questions that I was hoping they would go away, but they're still here. So one of the questions I had was in relations to like what happens, you know, to these properties, to these schools once we're no longer utilizing them. And then another question that goes along with that is, are these shifts somewhat temporary, or could they be considered temporary? For example, if we find ourselves in a different budgetary area. Yeah. So I don't know how you would address that, but those have been two of my questions I've had.
I really think that the facilities and operations would explore more of those options on what happens to the facilities or those buildings long term. And so those would be ongoing conversations. Larry, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Zach is absolutely correct. Facilities and operations would begin pursuing options for those buildings. As soon as we have an idea of direction, the one thing we would not want to do is have a building sitting empty in a community. The building does need to be used, whether that's used by the school district or by another entity. It would be our interest to have the buildings used by the community in some way.
Yes, Melissa, microphone. Oh, they're both at the back table.
Does this capacity scenario include district programming such as specialized classrooms?
So that was one thing that we did take into consideration. And so especially at Deerfield, where we're increasing headcounts there, and we know that special programs are there, Sunflower. So it is something that we worked with that department, but still we need to flush out fully to make sure that we're doing what's best for those kiddos as well.
Zach, could we consider start times, like tiered start times? Because this is, I know we still have a transportation piece to go over, but because it's a larger area, that's going to increase travel times. It's going to increase, bus times and things like that. So did we explore at all, like tiered starts to kind of offset that a little bit?
So I haven't yet. Again, we've really just been focused on the scenarios that are possible, that are really feasible, given the number and the buildings and all of those separate things. I know that this district, like considering all of Broken Arrow students going now to Schwagler, they used to go to Wakarusa and then Broken Arrow, and so this would be some travel time and transportation in there that we'd be looking at. I don't know if it'd be more or less transportation time where the location of the school is, but
I'd have to look at everything to figure out like where. I'd have to look at everything to figure out how it would increase it. But right now, I mean, we complete probably 90% of the routing in under 2 hours. So, and that's for the entire district. I mean, that's high school,
Yeah.
elementary school, and everything. So I'm just curious on how that is going to fluctuate, up or down. So it's just kind of.
and we will work closely with you on that. Thanks, Eric.
And I just have a comment. I mean, this is a lot to process, and I feel like we can't give, really great input without a fuller picture and transportation and all that. But the alarm bells that immediately rang in my head were that it seems like we're essentially combining a lot of low SES kids into the same buildings. I mean, if we're talking about Woodlawn, Pinckney, and New York together, and then combining Liberty Memorial with Billy Mills, that just seems like a really lopsided and uneven SES distribution across our schools. So again, that was just my first reaction and concern to this scenario.
Thank you for sharing that.
And this is Kay online. I would probably kind of agree with that observation. One of the things I think about, as we talked about, it's one scenario to kind of look at combining our smaller schools just because of size. It would be interesting to kind of look at a proposal in where we're looking at some of these larger schools feeding into smaller schools. So just so it's on the table, I think it would be interesting to see some of that.
Our purpose is for cost savings and shifting students from larger schools to smaller schools to fill up those schools. We're not realizing the cost savings that we've been directed to realize. And so our objective here from our committee, from the budget committee, they asked us to look at those boundaries of closing schools. So the recommendation that came to us was to look at closing schools. Our directive was not looking at filling up smaller schools or shifting. And so I just want to be clear that the Boundaries Committee wasn't given that as an option. The option was closing schools. So that came directly from the Budget Committee or the subcommittees. Okay, so we have scenario 2. Scenario 2 is actually tied very closely to scenarios 3 and 4. So in scenario 2, it's moving students at the elementary level from either scenario 3 or scenario 4, and moving students from Liberty Memorial Central. Okay? So what you're looking at is just the Liberty Memorial Central move. So it's looking specifically at the middle schools and their capacities in kind of a breakdown there. And let me scroll up so we can go to scenario 2. Okay. So on scenario 2, it is dependent upon Broken Arrow, space at Broken Arrow. So you'll see in scenario 3 and scenario 4 that Broken Arrow is part of both of those. Primarily because Broken Arrow has been identified as a school that for academic purposes, for construction and investment and capital purposes, has been identified as a school that we can shift students out of, but also because it then can allow Liberty Memorial to be a school, a middle school, that enters the conversation of shifting kids. So that's why Liberty Memorial and Broken Arrow are tied together, because Broken Arrow is on the table, Liberty Memorial is also a possibility. So here we have what Liberty Memorial will look like, and I'm going to go again to the map, and actually I need to change this to our middle schools so we can explore what this looks like. So there's going to be a number of students that move to west. So we see a transfer of students from west, and I believe it's this group here would transfer to west. West would also transfer students out to southwest, including this pocket up here of students would now go to southwest, which would also make sense because those students, the Langston Hughes students up there, or the Quail Run students are now going to Langston Hughes, and those students would now go to southwest. And then there's a sliver in here of these students that would also
Hey, Zach,
transfer
are you
out of
still
west.
talking?
Sorry, what was that? Can you hear me? Apparently not.
GR, I heard you say something, but I have not heard Zach respond.
I know.
Can you hear
I
this
figured when his
microphone?
mouse stopped all of a sudden that he heard me.
Can you hear this microphone?
GR, can you give us a thumbs up?
Can you give us a thumbs up, GR?
I'm not muted. GR, can you hear me?
I can hear you with an echo.
Oh, how about now?
I heard you with an echo.
Dang it.
Can you hear this, GR?
Let me stop sharing. GR, are you able to hear me now? See my phone. Can I hear myself on YouTube? Okay, so something with WebEx. Is broken. Let's use system. What do you think, Zach?
I think it's got to be something here.
Everybody online, I feel all your eyes staring at me as we wait for something to happen. It's very unsettling.
We don't want that.
We
want that.
yeah. Test. Test, can you guys hear us?
Should we kick everybody out? Kick everybody out. GR, can you give us a thumbs up? Anything?
Test.
GR, can you give us a thumbs up?
I mean, can we have Denise log out and log back
You
in?
get back there and I can hear you on the stream still. It's just they can't hear you for some reason.
Everybody muted? No. Because I can hear them.
Yeah.
They come through the system. They can hear me on here. You want to mute that?
Sure.
Can you hear me
Can
now?
you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah, but there's the echo.
That's
We've
the
still
echo.
got the echo. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on the panel. Where's that at? Sound
It's right
panel.
here.
Yeah, just mute the lectern.
Zach,
It's going to play through the sound system.
Hey, can you guys hear us? Test.
Can you hear me
Can
now?
you hear me now?
Dang it. Echo?
Echo?
Yes.
It's gonna feed back in. even though I'm-
It will.
You can't do that.
I'm just trying to think of why.
Can we put closed caption on?
Yep.
Okay. We're turning on closed captioning. But that's not working either.
It's like the iMac isn't connecting to the sound system. Like that.
It all is.
Hey, can you guys hear us?
I heard that.
Test, 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 test.
Just use the internal mic.
can you hear this, GR?
Yes. Yep.
Wait, can you hear this?
Yes.
We did it.
No echo.
Hey, I can respond to you and not look like an idiot the last 500 times you asked if I could hear, and I just stared at you.
Okay, what do you got, GR?
Nothing. You were.
Oh,
I could tell
that's
you were
right.
still talking when you were going around on the map,
Okay.
but we couldn't hear anything. So I didn't want to miss the magical words that you were saying. So I just said, "Zach, are you still talking?" Which
Oh my.
apparently now may become a T-shirt.
Erica does have a question comment.
I do. Thank you. So the district does have like an equity analysis tool to analyze the question that you brought up, which was great. I have a little bit of a different perspective. I see this as an opportunity for maybe the schools that are lower SES to move them into a larger community that has more resources. And so I think that's a great opportunity to consider, especially when we're talking about combining and like just enrichment from that perspective. So I think it's a great opportunity for the students. And could you remind us of the timeline? Because we we can't really get too much into the weeds, but you know what I mean? Like we have like a timeline to be aware of, to make a recommendation to get back to BPEC, so we can't
Yes.
go into the weeds too
Kathy
much.
has been the holder of the timeline, so I'm going to pull her up here.
I think the key timeline is that if a school closure occurs and the building that is empty is not reused for an educational purpose, so you're not repurposing it, and maybe special education programs move into it, or another educational setting, so it's truly a closure. There are requirements for publication in the newspaper, a week apart, a hearing that has to occur after so many days, but no longer than so many days, those kinds of things. And in order to navigate through that timeline and then kind of the notification of staff and just the variety of pieces and parts, the final decision doesn't come later, but the hearings and the notifications, the board would need to at least be able to know enough to put into a hearing which buildings are potentially to be closed, the reason for that, and kind of where the kids would be going from the building that's closed. And they would need to navigate forward with that really by the February 14th board meeting, because then you have to do the publication in the paper. There's the 2 weeks apart. You've got spring break that falls in there. That's kind of with existing meeting dates as they fall. You know, if you tried to figure out a different special meeting date and really tried to manipulate it, you might be able to squeeze another week or something out. But to really follow a clean timeline and give people ample time to have those hearings, have those conversations, because then the board would be navigating back really towards the end of March, first one of April. I don't have that timeline in my exact head for the actual approval or not approval of the closure. So there's still a lot of time and conversation, but those other pieces have to be out there and kind of navigated forward. And the fine-tuned details will continue to emerge as those hearings occur, as these great questions surface, and it will just be, it's kind of a tandem process that has to happen. We won't have all the answers right at the beginning. Through those conversations, we can get to our answers that then later the board can have that really bigger understanding to actually make a decision, yay or nay. You could go through the whole hearing process and get to that approval process and go, no, we're not doing it. And so we have to have an alternate plan. So does that help a little bit?
Okay, so we went over some of scenario 2, and that's dependent on Broken Arrow. Again, we can see the capacity numbers there at the middle school. We still have a cushion at our middle schools. You can see that Liberty Memorial, I need to take those numbers out as well, go across there. So capacity needs to be 0 in this particular scenario. Are there any questions about scenario 2? Because they tie closely to scenario 3 and 4. But we can also have scenario 3 and 4 on their own, and that would be 2 buildings. So in scenario 2, you're having the middle school, and then you're having one of these 2 options. So that's scenario 2, the middle school and one of these. Scenario 3 is just these 2 schools, Broken Arrow and Woodlawn. And then scenario 4 is just Broken Arrow in New York. So does everybody see the connection between scenario 2 and 3 and 4? Okay. So in scenario 3, we're moving students from Broken Arrow, again, for reasons already identified about Broken Arrow. And then we're also moving students from Woodlawn. I actually ran a scenario where we attempted to move students from 3 elementary schools. It's not feasible given our boundaries. And so 2 elementary schools are the scenarios that you're seeing in scenario 3 and 4. One of the things that I looked at, and if I can pull up this sheet, is, and Here, I have it here. So here is all the elementary schools, count of students. The difference to 85% capacity, you can see, is 611. We can add another 611 students to our current schools in order to be at the 85% capacity. We can add another 1,194 students. But first, let me share my screen so that the people everywhere else can see what number we're seeing here. So on this spreadsheet, it's a separate spreadsheet. It's not one that's in front of you. It's one that I was working off of. And so what you're seeing here, close that so it's a little bigger on the screen, is 611 to get all buildings at 85%. We'd have to redo some boundaries and redistribute kids, but we could have about 611 students. Like I mentioned earlier, growth is not trending in that direction, but we have that capacity. So then when I combine schools, we're looking at 469. Obviously, we need to subtract out those to get the new capacity here, which is what we do down here. So we still have capacity within our elementary schools when we run the option of Broken Arrow and Woodlawn, which you're seeing here. So there I actually took them out, I documented the moves, and we'd still have, with those two buildings out and redistributed out of the equation here, we still have some buildings not at that 85%, and we have still 600 seats available before we're at a 95% capacity. Again, we've never seen that type of growth year over year, and so we would have some lead-in time if we were trending in that direction to make some decisions. And so going back to scenario 3, what we were just referring to, Broken Arrow and Woodlawn, students are redistributed. The Broken Arrow students we've already walked through. We were able to Quail Run, shift students to 2 schools. Then we were able to shift Sunflower into Quail Run, Schwagler over to Sunflower, Broken Arrow into Schwagler. For Woodlawn, we would shift some students from Prairie Park to Hillcrest, and we've identified south of, now that we've switched that, let's go back to elementary. Get our elementary students up there. We would end up students here south of 6th that would shift over to Hillcrest, adding more students to Hillcrest. We would also move some other students out of Hillcrest. Those non-ESOL students would move into Sunset Hill. And then we would redivide. Sorry. Apologies. We would then divide Woodlawn into New York and Prairie Park, or I'm sorry, into Pinckney. And so I'll zoom out using Locust and Maple as a divide, and having these students come down to New York, and north of Locust, including those north, going into Pinckney. So that's how we would divide in scenario 3, Broken Arrow and Woodlawn students. And we can see on table 2, table 2, the capacity and the difference at each of the elementaries.
So in both scenarios, we have 3 title schools going together into one school. Is that correct? With like Woodlawn, New York, Pinckney?
Woodlawn would move into Pinckney
Right.
and to New York.
So in scenario 1 and 2, we have 3 title schools going into one school.
So in scenario 1, we have that situation. In scenario 2, we have Liberty Memorial moving,
Right.
and then one of these 2 options. And
Right.
so,
Well, I understand Broken Arrow, but Woodlawn's either going to, so we're going to have part of Woodlawn going to Pinckney and part of Woodlawn going to New York.
yes.
So again, all those would be title buildings in one building. Just
So
trying to.
you would have 2 buildings that would remain title buildings, so additional supports would still be available to any of the students that move.
And then how does all this impact high school? And that might be down the road, but
It's not down the road because that's also what we explored when it comes to feeder patterns. It's not going to change the boundaries for high school. There's no good way to redivide those boundaries to make true feeder schools. If we wanted to even them out a little more, we could explore that. But for our purpose here, our directive was looking at the scenarios of moving students out of buildings. Quentin, did you have a comment? Okay. Yes, Lindsay. Larry? Lindsay has a comment.
I'm just curious if FTE, like what the reduced FTE would be from each of these scenarios.
And I think that's something that the budget committee, now that I've given them the tables, this is what was requested, the grade level, so that you can look at sections, so you can then run those numbers of FTE in the transfers. So that's going to be in the budget committee. That'll be on Wednesday. Okay. Any other? Oh, great.
Hey, Zach, this is Kay. I just had a quick clarification question. So in this scenario, with Broken Arrow Elementary students, does that still bring over Liberty Memorial? And I don't think it does, but I wasn't sure, so I wanted to ask.
No, so in scenario 3 is just the 2 elementary schools, not a middle school. Okay, scenario 2 includes the middle school and one of 3 or 4.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Erica.
Yes, I have a follow-up question. So which of the scenarios that you've presented here, in your expert opinion, which one is least disruptive to students, families, and staff, and has the greater cost savings associated with it?
Okay. We haven't talked about scenario 4 yet, but I'll touch on scenario 4 to answer your question, okay? So the next one we were going to look at is Broken Arrow to New York. And to answer your question, scenario 4 is, in my opinion, of looking at that, more disruptive than scenario 3. Scenario 1 is more disruptive, but you'll see the greatest cost savings there. That's kind of why it's more disruptive. And then scenario 2 is also going to have some disruption. If I was to suggest scenario 2, I would say scenario 2 with scenario 3, so a middle school and then Broken Arrow and Woodlawn as kind of an intermediate. Understanding if the objective is the cost savings, scenario 1 is going to be the most amount of cost savings. Scenario 4 will be the least amount of cost savings and probably more disruptive than scenario 3.
I was just gonna comment, this is Nikki online. I 100% understand that the directive is to save money, but I also feel like if we are readjusting most of the boundaries anyway, when it comes to like scenario 1, for example, I think we also really need to be thinking about equity. And this is also an opportunity to have the opportunities that are currently not evenly distributed across schools by having high income parents, or families that have more resources and time and money they can give to the schools. And also with having kids who may be more likely to have experienced trauma concentrated in a smaller number of schools, it's just hard to have enough resources to support them. So I feel like there is a way to do both if we are shuffling things anyway. And I personally would like to see some different scenarios. Like if we are shuffling anyone anyway, what does it look like to try to look for budget savings and having a different distribution?
Do you have suggestions?
I guess one thing I was just thinking about with the middle schools, it just seems like because they're not as neighborhood based anyway, I just wonder if there are different ways to draw those lines that are maybe pretty far removed from what we were before, but would maybe even things out a little bit more. But I don't feel like I have a good enough sense of where the low income pockets are in the community to know where to draw them. I don't know.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. And when we look at it, you can see that we do keep track of our free and reduced lunch students, which is a pseudo indicator for poverty. We also overlay on these charts some of the census tract data. We do have, and it's more recent and it's just in the final stages of development, an equity tool that we will be using to analyze these decisions. And so we can look at those boundaries and where students go, but it also becomes somewhat unreasonable to, if we look at this map here, if we're saying that we want these students to go to Southwest Middle School, right? That they're crossing two other boundaries and now there's transportation, they're on a bus for a while, or those barriers. So there's some difficulties with just where those pockets are and how to move them around and adjust appropriately, just because our city is laid out in a specific way as well.
So this is a follow-up to the question that was just asked, and I'm gathering information at this point. So when we talk about the concern, we do have the equity analysis tool, which I'm very grateful the district has spent resources putting that together, just so we can identify any inequities that we wouldn't recognize if we didn't have that tool. So I'm very, very happy about that. So when we talk about the concern of combining low SES schools together, are we with a lot of certainty that we will not have enough resources, or is that an assumption? I just need some clarity around that.
Oh, get a mic. Thank you, Melissa.
Personally, I have been the principal of a school that was combined with 3 title buildings. And academically, we struggled. Behaviorally, we struggled with resources, even though we had title money. It was not, I think, if you look at research, it will show you that having a varied socioeconomic status in a building will have a benefit on both parties. And so that's my concern, because I've been in this situation, and I was in the situation years down the road from when they combined, and it never got better.
Sorry, can we get a microphone to Erica to ask that question? The people online wouldn't be able to hear you, sorry.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that context. So is that, in your experience, that unique to Lawrence, or is that a national statistic?
Melissa, we're going to have you repeat it.
I don't think it's unique to Lawrence.
Can we get some data to back that up? Either way, just not really to back it up, but just data, just so we know, is it an assumption? Is it, we can say with some amount of certainty that combining those schools Without the appropriate resources, it's not going to be good for those students. But I really need just more concrete data and not going off of feelings and things like that.
I can definitely appreciate that. One of these things, the students are currently located in buildings, and so we're bringing almost all of them to specific buildings. So you get both sides of it that are coming in because it's a neighborhood school. There was a comment in the chat that I just put up
Zach,
there.
we do have a question here.
Okay. Nope.
One of the things I was just sitting here thinking as we were talking about this, if we're worried about equalizing, I think we were discussing basically just SES, right? Of the what are the unintended consequences of trying to move kids maybe from one side of town all the way to the other side of town just because we're trying to even out some of those numbers? You know, you're looking at things like transportation, a complete shift in community. You know, I think those are all things that we need to think about, that just because we're sitting here talking about making the numbers look even, you know, some of those families they're not going to want to go across town just because it looks better in terms of numbers.
And I think that it's really important that as we look at some of the research, that we don't make the mistakes that maybe Melissa has seen in the past, that we are very conscientious of giving additional supports there or making sure the structure is in place that needs to be in place. And so maybe some of that cost savings comes down a bit because we ensure that it's there. But our focus and our goal for this is we've been charged by the budget committee to look at those savings. And so we've done the best we could. I feel like we've done the best we could when it comes to boundaries and some of the difficulties in there. And making it streamlined while also being sensitive to some of those issues.
This is
you
Kay.
You need a microphone, Erica. Go ahead,
This
Kay.
is Kay online. And so one of the things that I think about when Kathy came up and talked to us a little bit about the hearing process and knowing that we have this equity tool, which is going to be really great for vetting out some of these things. This process has still a long way to go. And so I think that why these are scenarios and possibilities and, you know, nothing set in stone. And we still have a lot of information to gather and statistics gathering, public to hear from. And so I think about, you know, we have to just provide some proposals so we can start talking as a larger group. So that's all I was going to say.
Sorry, Erica, go ahead.
So I am interested in seeing the equity tool analysis on all 4 proposals, and then going to the experts in this area that have experienced this, so we do have a better idea of what the unintended consequences could be, and not only that, have a mitigation strategy in place at the same time to ensure we don't fall into those traps. And so we're at a position where we have to make tough decisions, and so I just really, from a board member perspective, I would like to have that information. Again, which one is, and you outlined this briefly, Dr. Conrad, but like which one is most destructive, least, which one has the most cost savings, kind of like label them like that, and then attach the equity analysis to each of those with the plan to address those inequities in each scenario.
Yeah, and we just saw the draft of that yesterday, of what that tool is going to look like. And so we fully intend on doing that with all these scenarios, on the ones that we especially plan to present to the board.
And I just had a quick comment. I got Boys and Girls Club closes at 6, so I'm gonna have to run out. So a couple of things. I just want to make sure, like, as we're sifting through all this data, which is important, and research, Erica is definitely important, but I also don't want to undervalue the really hard-working principals and administrators and teachers who can sort of also give us like what they're seeing on the ground, and you know, kind of what you were saying about resources and such. it sounds like the equity tool is in a draft format, so I don't know how useful that will be.
Well, yeah, Dr. Johnson just showed us the draft. Yes, it's almost complete and finalized, and so we're right there.
And then the last thing, and you mentioned this, but that you were working on building Hillcrest into this.
Yeah,
kind of
ESOL, that
equation.
was one of
I
the
feel like
committees, yep.
Hillcrest, I mean, if we look at actual Hillcrest numbers of students who reside in that area,
It's 152.
they're lower
It's
than
152,
any
yeah.
other school. So I just feel like that needs to be included in the scenarios here, because if those ELL students are already being transported, I feel like they can be transported anywhere. Hillcrest is in super close proximity, like what, a mile or so away from the one by West,
Sunset Hill.
Sunset Hill, and I feel like a lot of those, if I'm looking at the boundaries, like a lot of kids live closer to Sunset Hill than they do to Hillcrest, but so I just want to make sure that that gets kind of included in discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, still working through the ESOL proposal. Now, what's trickier is finding a second building that wouldn't be as impacted as Hillcrest. Now, it's much easier to fill capacity moving east than it is moving west. And so having another cluster site to take on the 180 ESOL students that do go to Hillcrest becomes the challenge. And yes, they're already being transported. And so we could figure that out, but there's financial implications to that as well. And so then finding a home for the 152, well, 152 don't fit squarely into Sunset Hill.
And I know this is not our charge, but just sort of putting it on the radar and evaluating whether cluster sites continue to be the best method of delivery for ELL students.
Absolutely.
So,
But at the same time, we have to make sure there's endorsements at all the other buildings, otherwise we're losing funding. Even though those students are still going to continue to get supported, we're going to lose funding on that, which is not our objective. So, yeah, Erica.
I just want to comment on what you said. I did say that it's important that we engage with our experts that have experience in this. So as a board member, I just want to clarify, just so there's no confusion, that we need to have data to make an informed decision, but we also need to engage with the people doing the work so we don't fall into the same traps we did previously. So I wanted to make sure that what I was saying was not misinterpreted. I did say specifically that we need to engage with our experts that we have here.
We have another comment here.
And I would just say, as I presume the only teacher here, and as a teacher on the west side, I really don't feel comfortable closing 4 schools. When we said at the very beginning, that closing schools weren't necessarily on the table without getting the input from teachers and admin on that side.
Thank you for sharing that. This is the beginning of the process, and we brought it here to the Boundaries Committee first because that's who you're representing, right? And so your voice is being heard here on the committee. And so we appreciate that. But obviously, this is going to continue in dialogue. I did also want to point out, this is my last slide, that we did explore Broken Arrow and Pinckney as a combination, and I could not make that work. Pinckney is butted up against Deerfield, and so transporting students, they'd have to go somewhere else, and they'd have to cross through 2 or 3 other boundaries in order to get there. It was too difficult to find a home for about 113 of those students up in this neighborhood. And so Pinckney was explored as one of those options. I just couldn't make it reasonably work given the boundaries of schools that surround it. And so I mentioned Pinckney early on. Pinckney's on proposal 1, but is not part of 2 elementary schools because of that. So with this, we've now explored 4 scenarios. We've heard the timeline. It's pretty narrow. We need to start putting some numbers to these, and that's going to happen with the budget committee. Kathy, what is going to be most useful to you in the budget committee with these 4 scenarios? Would you like us to choose one that you guys can really dive into, give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or eliminate one and you look at the rest?
Ouch. It's really kind of, we could come up with cost numbers for all of them, and then you can come back and kind of look at that as the next phase. It's just a matter of, the biggest piece of this is, there's some standard positions that are just givens, and then understanding where the staffing piece goes with and what those class sizes would look like. And so that part is, once the template's set up, we can just put those numbers in and look at all of them. So you might as well look at all of them. That way you at least kind of have gone through fruition through that first layer. And then from there could be some very obvious ones that just they navigate off routinely, kind of just easy. So we'll just move ahead with the ones you've provided, and then we'll wrap back around with that information.
I would like to mention that our next boundary meeting, I should have the ESOL in Hillcrest. So we'll be able to look at that scenario as well. Is everybody comfortable that these are plausible and we can move these scenarios back to the budget committee so that they can actually put numbers on it?
Yes, I would say that I'm comfortable looking at these more, but I would also be really interested in terms of the work before the next meeting to see maybe a different scenario that looked at SES distribution among the school, maybe one that maybe didn't save as much money, but drew the boundaries in a way that distributed kids more evenly. And it'd be really helpful for next iterations, I know you have so much work to do, but to see kind of the percentage of kids in each school who are on free and reduced lunch, if that's the marker that the research says is the best one to look at for equity, rather than just the raw number, because it's a little harder to compare.
So on all of I want to draw our attention to the last table on any of the scenarios is the free and reduced lunch table. And so you can get the numbers off of that. You have the total, and then total number of students would be on the first table that you'd be able to calculate a percentage there. That's how we're going to calculate title status. And so that's why that table is in there.
Hey, Zach. This is Kay, real quick. I just wasn't quite sure if there's a graph. Well, you know how you have the map and you're showing just the different movements. Is there anything visual like that you could I don't know, provide? Because it would be great to have a little bit more time looking at that.
I can provide the graphic that I use. It would be static for you, so that you'd be able to mark it up and erase as you want. Mine's more interactive, where I can draw lines and populate tables with it. But if you would find that useful, of all the dots of the students, I would struggle with making it large enough so that you could have individual dots and kind of understand that. You're also going to be limited to know how many students are within that dot. And so it might look like 30, but it might actually be 70, right? And so that'll limit you as well in looking at that chart, but I'm more than happy to provide that for you.
Thank you.
Oh, we have one more comment here, and we're going to wait on the microphone so that everybody can hear it.
Could we get the tables you were showing for each scenario, where it's each school and how many kids would transfer between each school? How many from Quail to this school, and for all of them?
So in the PowerPoint slides, there's a general idea, and I'll send those around. We'll make sure that those get out. But even the numbers that I put in there are rough estimates. I drew the circle and said, okay, this is going to be the boundary. It's about that many kids. But when I actually moved the kids, I had to move it from their student ID numbers so that these tables would be accurate. So I actually, even the comments on there are more about the boundaries and giving me an idea of how many students are there and what could work. And then when I actually did the work, I did that in an entirely separate sheet with student IDs on it. And so I can be more descriptive about where those boundary changes are, and that might be more useful. Would that work? Okay. I know we've gone past our time barrier. Are there any other questions?
No additional questions, but I just wanted to tell you thank you for the work that you guys are doing to to help us move forward with this. It's really important, so thank you for the time that you put in.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and close out of WebEx. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.